So this is chapter 12, section 2, the Texas Revolution. So originally, the land where Texas is today was owned by the Spanish. And then Mexico gained its independence from Spain, and it became property of Mexico. And then by the time this section's over, Texas is going to be its own country before it becomes a state in America. So there are a lot of different reasons why people wanted to move into this Texas area. It originally was known as Tejas, so that's how we get the word Texas from the Spanish Tejas. They had good trees for building homes out of wood. It had good rich soil for corn and cotton, and it had good grassy plains for grazing animals. So those are all good reasons. Here's a map of what the area looked like originally. It takes up a lot more than what Texas just is today. There's part of New Mexico, part of Arizona, and then here's a Louisiana Purchase here on the right side. So on August 24, 1821, not May 5th, so Cinco de Mayo just happened, right? May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, that's 100% made up holiday that Americans made up. They do not celebrate Cinco de Mayo in Mexico, and it's not even close. Look, May 5th, August 24th. And Native Americans, just like Native Americans lived on a land of Louisiana Purchase, Native Americans also lived here. So Comanche, Apache, and other tribes weren't happy that these whites were moving into their territory. So what American Indian tribe fought? Out of these four, it's Apache. And then Stephen Austin was given permission to start a colony in Texas. Today, Austin, Texas is the capital of Texas. It's named after him. So who was given first permission? Stephen Austin. So under the new Texas government that now Spain doesn't run Texas, but Mexico runs Texas, Austin's grant was useless. But the Mexicans wanted people to move to the area to stop other foreign countries from possibly moving in and to fight against the natives. So if the settlers agreed to become Mexican citizens and members of the Roman Catholic Church, they were allowed to move there. So what religion did the new settlers have to join? The Roman Catholic Church. And then here's a picture of Stephen Austin right here. But by 1830, the whites that moved into Texas from America outnumbered the Tejanos 6-1. So this was becoming more of an American territory than it was of a mixed race territory of Spanish and Mexicans moving in. So what was the problem in Austin's settlement in Mexico? More Americans came than the Mexicans came. And tensions started between the Americans and the Tejanos, the people from Mexico that really wanted to run it. And tensions continued to get worse. The Mexican government started to crack down on Texas. They closed the state to any future American immigrants. They made the Texans pay taxes. They sent way more troops. Basically, the only thing they didn't do was stop food shipments from going to Texas. They did everything else to make it harder for the Americans living in Texas. So, of course, this caused protests. Some Texans said, hey, we should just leave. We have enough people. We can make this our own country. We can just take it off the Mexicans. But most remained loyal to Mexico. They were happy they were living in a nice life, making good money, and really, the Mexicans didn't cause them that many problems. And then at the time, the leader of Mexico, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, not only was their Mexican president, but like George Washington, he was also the main army general. And when he learned of a letter, and this painting's supposed to depict him reading this letter, he learned of a letter that Austin wrote that supported the idea of Texas breaking away from Mexico. He wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. So the general had Austin jailed for an entire year. So they captured Austin, they put him in jail for an entire year. The Mexicans were furious, and Santa Anna sent more troops to Texas. So what did he do to Austin? He put him in prison for a year. So then in September of 1835, the Mexican soldiers were sent to a place called Gonzales, where there was a cannon that the Mexican government gave the people of Texas to use to protect themselves against American Indian fighting. Well, the Texans weren't happy about this. These Texas volunteers hung a flag, had a big gun on it. Here's a picture of the flag. It says, "Come and get it." And the idea was the Mexicans wanted that cannon back. They thought that the Texans might use the cannon against them if there was going to be a war, so they wanted to get the cannon back. So think how crazy that was. If there was a war, one cannon isn't going to determine who wins the war. But they were like, well, we gave it to you, now we want it back. We don't want you shooting any of our guys with our own cannon. So why was the Mexican army sent there to get the cannon? Because they were afraid they were going to use it against them. So the Mexican troops failed to capture the cannon. And 2 months later, Texans drove the Mexican troops out of an old mission in San Antonio called the Alamo. So this was a building that they were using to get people to join their Roman Catholic Church, and Santa Anna was furious about this. That's not your property. This whole town's not your property. So he sent 6,000 troops to Texas to get back the Alamo. So what group originally controlled the Alamo? The Mexicans. So March 1st and 2nd, 1836, the Texans met at a settlement to decide what should they do. And at this meeting, they decided that they were going to make Sam Houston the commander of the Texas Army. And then later, when Texas gained its independence and became its own country for a short time, Sam Houston became its first president. And there also is a city, pretty big city actually, in Texas named after him. So at the meeting, they decided they're going to make him commander of the Army. And then later on, he becomes the first president. So who was placed in charge of Texas Army? Sam Houston. So at the time, there were only 2 small forces ready to stand up against Santa Anna's thousands and thousands of men at the Alamo. So 6,000 versus 100 or 420 people. 183 of them were volunteers. One person that was a famous frontiersman that was there was Davy Crockett. Another person that was pretty famous, there's a knife named after him now, Jim Bowie, were also there. Now the men at the Alamo wanted Bowie to be the leader, but he was not allowed to be the leader. And so this is a picture of the Alamo today. If you ever went to San Antonio, Texas today, that's what the Alamo looks like today. It's a tourist attraction. You can go visit it. So the real leader of the Alamo was a guy named William Travis, even though the men wanted Bowie to be the leader. So Santa Anna's troops show up on February 23rd, and the next day the Mexicans begin a siege. So if you remember way back from French and Indian War time, they bombed the Alamo from the outside. The Alamo's defenders held off the Mexican attack for 12 violent days before the big battle on the 13th day, where they ran out of ammunition and the Mexican army charged into the Alamo. So 13 days total, 12 of a siege and 1 of a battle. 13 days total was the Battle of the Alamo. So many different people helped the Texans at the Battle of the Alamo. The Tejanos, people that were mixed Mexican and white blood. Free African Americans were there. Slaves were there. White volunteers were there. Who's missing from this group? What group of humans did not help fight at the Alamo for the Texans? The United States Army is not involved yet. So again, a siege is when you fight from far distance, bombing your enemy until eventually you can go attack them when they are much weaker. So on the 13th day, Santa Anna ordered more than 1,800 of his 6,000 men to storm the fort. The Texans had run out of ammunition, and by a day's end, all but 5 Texans were dead. And I have a woman here circled, we're going to talk about a little later in this painting. So how long did the battle take? 13 total days. Why did the Texans stop fighting on the 13th day? They ran out of bullets. And then a person that's Susanna Dickinson was left to be a survivor and was ordered by Santa Anna to tell the story of the Alamo. So they didn't want to kill everybody. So they wanted, even though Davy Crockett and Bowie were killed, Travis was killed, they wanted this Dickinson lady to tell a story about how dominant the Mexican army was, and then to show Santa Anna had a heart by letting this woman and a couple other people and a couple kids live, to show that he wasn't a monster. So revenge was on the minds of the Texans. Santa Anna continued on the attack until they had the Battle of Goliad. And now what this is a picture that the Texans made for a flag for the battle. Even though they lose this battle, it was symbolic of the Texans' willingness to face any sacrifice. So what this is basically showing is they were showing, I'd cut my right arm off if I had to beat the Mexican army. But once again, at this battle, the Mexicans won too. And so now Santa Anna has momentum. And then eventually Santa Anna caught up with Houston's army near the San Jacinto River. And on the afternoon of April 21st, 1836, the Texans advanced on the Mexican army. So the Texans are 0-2, the Mexican army's 2-0, and now they're going to have this next battle. They got close to Santa Anna's camp. They start screaming, remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. And in 18 minutes, the Texans killed more than half of the Mexican army, and Santa Anna was forced to surrender. So once again, one major battle of a war can determine the victors of the war. So after losing this one big battle, the victory of San Jacinto, Texas gets its independence under the leadership of Sam Houston. So its only major win, the Battle of San Jacinto. That's all the wins you have to have if your enemy quits. And Texas then became its own country for a time. And this is the flag, the Burnett flag, that they use to make the Texas flag of today. It was known as the Lone Star Republic because it only had one star. It was by itself. And the Texans raised this flag in 1836 to show that they had gained their independence. Sam Houston now goes from being the general of the army, now he's the president in a landslide election. So now, should they be independent or should they join America? So many Texans did not want Texas to remain independent for long. Their idea was, how long is it going to take for Santa Anna and the Mexicans to recapture them and make them part of their country? So in 1836, the Texas government asked Congress, can we please be part of America? Now, many Northerners didn't want Texas to become a state. They were afraid because it was below the Missouri Compromise line, it was going to be a slave state, which by rule it had to be. And it took Texas nearly 9 years before it became a state. So in 1845, eventually it became the 28th state, and the North didn't want another slave state, but it got it anyway. And that's section 2.